So the next section of this is just a list that Foster has created. And when he created, I think they're a little tongue-in-cheek, sometimes a little bit sarcastic, in terms of looking at characters who may or may not be Christ figure-like. So as you go through, again, a character doesn't have to have all of these things, but your allusion radar should turn on when you see some of these things showing up in literature. For example, if you have a character who is crucified, literally, that would be Christ. But how about crucified symbolically? So somehow publicly humiliated. That can be a crucifixion also. Perhaps as wounds in the hands, feet, side, or head. Just because somebody gets hurt in a war doesn't necessarily mean that, oh wow, that wound in the hand makes them Christ-like. No, you gotta look at the whole picture. But sometimes when you see characters who are very specific in terms of where they are wounded and those parallel where Christ was wounded at various times, you could be looking at a Christian allusion. In addition, if you have a character who is in great prolonged agony, pain, that could be an allusion to Christianity. More description here. These go back to some of the stories about Christ in that New Testament. The idea that Christ would be self-sacrificing, giving himself in a painful way for the betterment of all. Do we have characters like that? Perhaps is good with children, good with loaves, fishes, water, and wine. That kind of goes to that whole feeding of the 5,000 story. Just because we have a character who knows how to bake doesn't necessarily mean it's Christ. Just because a character likes to fish doesn't necessarily mean he is or isn't Christ, but he could be. The last one there was 33 years of age when last seen. Just because a character is 52 doesn't mean they can't be Christ-like, and just because someone is around 30-ish doesn't mean they necessarily are. But just another one of our checklist pieces to look at and say, hey, perhaps this character is supposed to be read at a different level. A couple other things. Is this character employed as a carpenter or some sort of similar work that Jesus might have had in the Bible? Is he or she known to be using humble modes of transportation? And then again, this is Foster's kind of tongue-in-cheek coming through, feet or donkeys preferred. Because again, Jesus was known to be walking in a lot of places, was known to have entered Jerusalem riding on the back of a donkey. And then the last one there, often portrayed with arms outstretched. Well, maybe somebody's just pointing down the road. That doesn't necessarily mean that because they're pointing that they are Christ. It could just mean they're pointing, so keep that in mind. But when you see a character over and over narrated to be with arms outstretched, or as a shepherd, or leading his flock, or something like that, then maybe we're supposed to read that character in a little bit deeper, more allusion-type manner. Additionally, if you have a character who is known to have spent time alone in the wilderness, oftentimes contemplating life, or something like that, then perhaps we are to read them similar to the trials of Jesus when he was in the desert, and then also when he was tempted by the devil. When you have a character like that, again, it could just mean that that person likes to walk in the woods. That person likes to stroll in the desert. It doesn't necessarily have to have a deeper meaning. But if we're keeping that checklist of potential allusions, those are a couple big ones right there. Couple more. Last seen in the company of thieves. As Jesus was crucified, he was placed in the middle of two other known thieves, so that could be part of that. Creator of many sayings and parables. We have things like turn the other cheek, are you your brother's keeper, things like that we look at and say those have pervaded our culture. Do we have a character who is known for witty sayings? Last one there, some sort of idea that this character may have died or been buried, but somehow rose again on that third day. And the number 3 is oftentimes biblically important, but this idea of rebirth could be asking us to look at a Christian allusion. And it doesn't always have to be literal. A character doesn't have to physically die and come back from the dead, zombie-like or Christ-like, to say, oh my goodness, that's Christian. It could just be that somebody disappears from the storyline for a couple days and comes back. It could be that a adventure over the course of an entire novel only takes 3 days. It could be that a courtroom trial, only lasts 3 days. And so we need to be aware of that number, but also this idea of being challenged and overcoming that somehow. A few more here. The idea of a figure having disciples. Does this character have people who closely follow him or her around, who are exceptionally devoted to this character? And then you can see the qualifier there, although not were equally devoted. We know that some of the disciples from the Bible were not completely, perfectly, 100% devoted. Judas, he's a pretty famous one, he kind of turned in Jesus to the Romans. And so even if we have a character who has a large following or a flock, they don't all have to be perfectly equally devoted. Character could be very forgiving. It could also mean just that they're nice. The author's trying to paint this as a nice character. And just because they forgive a wrong doesn't necessarily mean that they're supposed to be Christ, but they could be. And then the last one there, the idea of Christ coming to redeem an unworthy world and then leaving that. And I think that parallels many of the Bible stories that Jesus comes down from God, comes from heaven, fixes the world, sacrifices himself, and then ascends into heaven. And so if you have characters like that, that could be what the author's after, trying to make them more Christ-like and making those allusions. And so some examples from literature just to try and start to make these a little bit more connected. What about Harry Potter? Was Harry Potter labeled oftentimes in some of the later books as, quote, the chosen one? The one to save this world from Voldemort? Did he die in this film series and book series? And then did he come back to life? On the level, it's a kid at a boarding school who's had a really rough life and a couple of crazy friends and does things like that. But is there the potential that this character is supposed to be read as something deeper? How about Superman? Does he come from another planet, help rid our planet of crime, and then leave? E.T.? Neo from The Matrix? Are these people kind of the selected ones to come in and save our world, or a world from the outside? Something to think about. Now, as we get into some of these other cues, they may not be cues surrounding Christ himself or some of the other cues that we've seen, but more in terms of the Bible as a whole. So keep that in mind as you look at these ones. How about the idea of baptism? In the Christian church, that's the ceremonial placing of water over somebody's head, and that symbolically cleanses original sin that we all got from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It stands for rebirth, perhaps moving from one stage of life to another. Well, how about a character who is standing out in the rain and comes back a different person? How about somebody who has to climb through something and then breaks through the water? I mean, while it may not be an actual Christian baptism, does the water carry some symbolic weight in that text? How about the idea of communion? In the Bible, this was represented by the Last Supper, where Jesus said to his disciples, "This is my last night on earth. One of you is going to betray me. Let us eat this bread and drink this wine. It symbolizes my blood, my body," that kind of stuff. Well, think about this in literature. Isn't it a given that characters are going to have to do things like go to the bathroom or eat? We're not going to have narration that explains every single time a character goes to the bathroom or eats. We just assume they do. So if an author is including a chapter or a part or even just a couple sentences where characters are eating together, might we need to read that as the act of communion? And not some sort of symbolic, like eating the body of Christ type thing, but maybe just the idea of coming together over food. So it doesn't have to be exceptionally formal, as in like lining up and receiving a wafer from a priest. It could just be people sitting around a campfire before an adventure. Does that campfire represent a Last Supper type of scenario? Probably the most famous image of that Last Supper is, The Last Supper by Da Vinci. You can see it here, Jesus in the middle, surrounded by his disciples on both sides. If it's important enough to be part of that Christian allusion series in the Bible, and we have a page or a scene in a book where characters are eating, might we be asked to connect these two together? A similar scene here from the movie MASH. during one of these scenes, the character in the middle is pretty important. He is deciding what he wants to do with his life, and his friends put on a kind of last supper for him. And you can see how they have framed this from the movie. That's not random. They were saying that this guy's Last Supper is similar to Jesus' Last Supper before his crucifixion. How about some other images, both from film and from literature? When we see an apple, we are probably supposed to be connecting that apple or forbidden fruit type idea back to the biblical story of Adam and Eve. And so think about all of those fairy tales where characters have been tempted. What are they tempted with? 9 times out of 10, it's an apple. How about the idea of serpents? I mean, why do we fear snakes? Yeah, they're kind of weird and creepy and they move around with no legs and they seem all slimy, although they're not. It seems like we as a culture fear serpents. Well, where does that come from? Is that biblical? The idea that the serpent encouraged the eating of the forbidden fruit. So is it intentional or random that Voldemort in the Harry Potter series is often connected to snakes? He can speak Parseltongue, allowing him to speak to the snake, that he has a snake Nagini that is his sidekick, and the fact that he just, kind of looks like a snake. That is probably all intentional. And so we have to turn on those illusion radars and pick up and see what's going on. And then the last one, just a general allusion, is to the idea of good versus evil. I think that is a running theme throughout the Bible of Jesus versus the devil, good versus evil, purity versus not, that kind of stuff. How many times do we see this thematic issue in pieces of literature? Darth Vader versus Luke Skywalker, Voldemort versus Harry Potter, foil pairs against each other in other texts. Good versus evil often comes through. This is not to say that the Bible is the only book that ever originated the idea of this. If you read religious texts from other religions, they also have strong thematic ties to the idea of good versus evil. But again, we're talking in Western literature here. And so our probably common knowledge text is that of the Bible. And so that's about it. Thank you so much for watching this. Again, the idea of looking for Christian allusions in specific is just another tool to go into your toolbox as you seek to read and interpret literature and move yourself toward a closer interpretation of theme, that overall lesson for all of humanity. So as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to bring those into class. We'll get those shored up and we will move from there. Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.